Well, it's my first time here in Estonia, and I'm trying to understand where I am. Of course, I feel many common things from my European background, let's say. But there are different cultural and historical issues that I only superficially know about. So I'm learning as we go, and this morning I was at the Foreign Affairs Ministry. They organized a meeting on Estonia and Africa, and it was really interesting on how they think that there could be mainly business relationships going on between these two far, geographically far, but also culturally far continents, but that today can be united in different ways. So I'll pick up some things that from this morning I was stimulated, but I want to also go through some main vision concepts of what we intend in general by social solidarity economy. And first of all, has any one of you ever heard about this term? Social economy, solidarity economy. Is it totally new to you, or you have some idea?
Superficially, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, what does it evoke?
Basically, people sharing things and consuming less in general, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be all about the physical things. It can be like you have a peer and you help him out somewhere in the neighborhood. It has a fair line with socialism.
You can speak.
Socialism.
Okay, that's interesting.
Similar in some small aspects.
Mm-hmm. Any other?
So I think it's in terms of social entrepreneurship, if you see kind of creating value for the society in terms of if you're an entrepreneur, you create some kind of business process or an app which is not driven by profit but rather solving the issue of the society. So I see it in terms of social entrepreneurship. So you are actually creating this kind of business model where all the social aspects are considered and you involve people into it. So it's based on that, I think so.
Thank you. So what you're saying is that normally the economy, the way we do economy does not include that aspect.
Well, if you see market-driven economy, so it's solely based on profit. You don't consider what impact it will have on society. Mm-hmm. So in terms of sustainable and solidarity, if you see green economy, you involve different part of society, and in terms you try to channelize the brain. Okay, use green energy, for example. Use put some kind of wind shield on your home and generate this kind of electricity, for example.
Okay, so
involving society again.
Thanks. I think we'll get into this quite rapidly. Any other, just a quick comment?
It's a kind of open, something like open innovation or open system where there are no fees or charges for anything, and there is an free exchange of ideas between the stakeholders for the benefit of the community.
Okay, so words are free, community. Welcome. Okay, let's see what of these first sort of impressions we find here. I'll go through quickly this map of Europe. Here you can see many logos. All these logos represent networks that are present in several countries, some in actually more than one country, but usually they are national networks, and they're all in some way promoting social and solidarity economy. So here we have RIPESS, which is the Spanish network of networks of alternative and solidarity economy. CHES is the Catalan one. There's the Portuguese one. There's RIPESS in France, which is the réseau, the network that brings together the universities who promote social economy and solidarity economy. They have masters, they have courses. This is also in Spain, a little bit in Germany. There's the Mouvement de l'économie solidaire in France. UFISC, which brings together all the sort of artists and creative self-entrepreneurs. There's Solidarische Ökonomie in Germany, the Forum, and so on and so forth. There's some that are sectoral. For instance, Urgency down there. It's the international network that links together all the CSAs, the community-supported agriculture. Those are the farms that have a community around them and that sell directly to the consumers. You might have heard about this already. And in Greece, there's Solidarity for All, which is bringing together some of the many solidarity initiatives that have sprouted out, especially with the austerity measures that came with the financial crisis and the Troika's decision, that is the European Commission, the European Central Bank, on how to deal with it with Greece. So there's a variety of very different actors that have in common a vision of the economy that we will see, and the fact of working together cross-sectorially, so independently of which kind of business sector they're in. Some are more rooted in the community, some have institutions. For instance, RTES is the network of local authorities, municipalities, etc., that promote social solidarity economy. And and there's some other institutional networks that are gradually getting in, usually at the local authority, at the city level. You said there's this one. Okay. So there's a network that brings all of these together, and it's called RIPESS. It's an intercontinental network. So that means that, as the map you've seen of Europe, there's similar ones in the other continents. And there are two main orientations of what this network wants to do. One is that it's helping bring together and create a movement of social transformation. That means changing, not just repairing some of the damages that market economy brings, but also radically changing the way we think and do economy in our communities. And the second one is solidarity economy is one of the different approaches. There are many others. It knows that it's not unique and it doesn't hold the truth. So in a way, it's different from past ideologies where you had one blueprint of the economy. It's this way. There's no other alternative. That's Margaret Thatcher in the 80s saying market economy is the end of history. That's it. This is what how the world has to work. No, that's not true. There are many other approaches. This is just a very short time in history that it has existed. And we can take the good parts of it, take the social innovation, the technologies, but use them in a very different way. So the idea is to converge the different approaches in a common vision. So the whole idea is, we know there's something very wrong in the system. I won't make the whole list of things. Each one has a different perspective on that approach. But there are many alternatives that already exist and that we can work on. From the food to energy to housing to different conception and way of working, to the way cities are organized, the way we organize common forms of transportation, to rethinking the way we produce things. So the next industrial revolution will not be huge supply chains that go throughout the whole globe, but it will be relocalizing production in very small factories that can use different forms of 3D printer technology, let's say, to reproduce cars, components of machinery, even houses, with new materials as well. All of this thinking of how to have an economy that is not extractive and destructive, but that is actually regenerative. So it uses the resources on the earth in an intelligent way. We have limited resources on this earth. It's a finite planet. And the more we extract and waste, the less we will have in the future. So we have to think of how to do it in a way that it can regenerate and that we don't create global problems like climate change, for instance. But besides all this, one of the key elements that we're looking at is that market economy doesn't include many of the social issues that we were saying about before. And it can create more and more inequality, more division between who has and who doesn't have, who has access and who doesn't have access, who has a job and who has a precarious job that will keep him in a loop of poverty for probably his whole life, who has social protection and who doesn't. So the idea that we need to re-inject democracy inside our workplaces, but inside our communities as well, is a very strong aspect and value that is part of the social solidarity economy. And it brings together the stream of rethinking what the public and the commons are. You spoke of socialism. Well, this is not a really that much socialistic kind of concept. Of course, there's an idea of cooperation and cooperatives because the way of working together and of common ownership and having one head, one vote is very important. But the cooperative itself or the social enterprise itself is not a state-owned and directed enterprise. It's not a enterprise owned by one private individual. It's co-owned by who works in it. So yes, it's socialistic in some aspects, but different from the sort of authoritarian forms of socialism that many have gone through in the last century. Self-organization, self-management is at the basis of this. And the movement that started social solidarity economy in Latin America came out of not just authoritarian regimes, but a philosophy and theology of liberation that has really created the common values and common vision that is behind this. So there are many roots. I was talking about cooperatives, but there's also the mutuals that come from at least two and a half century old concept, the thing that you pool together resources, you create a common fund. It can be in a community, it can be in a workplace, to be able to have a sort of insurance that when some situation happens, usually mutuals started with health or problems with jobs. So there were groups of workers that pooled together money in a common fund, and then if someone got sick, since there was no welfare state that could provide, they could have their mutual to pay for their cures. But today, we can use the concept of mutual and the practices for many other things. For instance, to co-finance community initiatives, or initiatives to revive common space. Let's say we want to have a public building that has been abandoned. We want to recuperate it, and we need some money to do it. That can be done through a mutual, or through crowdfunding, or through different other ways. There's a whole idea of ecological transition, and a movement that started in the UK called Transition Towns. Have you heard about it? Anyone? And that movement is rethinking the way we produce and consume energy, but out of that, then all the other things that are connected to it. So if we are able to work on democratizing also the way energy is produced and consumed, that is, not having central production of energy, but having it distributed on our roofs, in local micro forms of renewable energy production, depending on, of course, on the place. Some places have a lot of sun, so that's a good idea, or water supply, or geothermic, etc. Then you can evolve with the technologies and make that energy more and more available. But we have to also think that we need to consume less energy, so that we need less. And that by doing that, we don't need so much megawatts production by nuclear power plant, or depend on gas and oil. Okay, I'll give you other two images just to stimulate you on this. This graph here, this circle, is divided in 3 parts. It's a bit the traditional way we are used to see, to envision what the economical system is. So there's the private sector, profit-oriented. Okay, it's the market. There's the public sector, the state, public provision. And there's what is called the social sector, or the third sector, which has the non-profit or low-profit enterprises, all the forms of social enterprises, community enterprises, voluntary work, small family businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And this division in 3 is sort of given for granted. But if you rethink the economy from the roots, then what we're looking at in social solidarity economy is a transsectorial kind of economy, where the public and the private are not a partnership, but they can be mixed. I'll give you an example. You can manage the water system in a city or in a region with a public company, with a private company, as most systems today have been privatized. I don't know how it is in Estonia today. Is the company managing your water and sewerage system private, or is it public? Do you know?
It depends on the municipality, actually.
It still depends on the municipality. So some still have public water sewage systems, and
For example, in Tallinn, the company is mostly privatized, but the city has some shares in the company.
okay, so it's mixed, public-private
Yeah.
ownership. But the model is a private model. The company is a private company, then has public shares in it. Okay, that's very important. What we're looking at is more community public model, where the ownership is also of the citizens, and where on certain issues you have a say, and it's not just the representatives in the government who decide how to manage or whether to privatize, for instance, a common asset. This means rethinking both our democratic system in general, so having representative democracy but also deliberative democracy. There are examples that come from Brazil as the participatory budgeting. Have you ever heard about this? The fact that the city says, okay, a part of our budget, say to build new schools or I don't know, for infrastructures, can be decided by the population.
In Tartu, we use it also.
Okay, great.
Well,
And is it working?
you could say that, yeah.
Okay, so
It's a very small budget.
Yeah.
I don't know how big it is.
yeah, well, that's usually a bit the problem. But it's good that it starts, because then you can experiment and see if it's actually working or not. But the concept is that we have to evolve from our system that divides in three parts and rethink how to best manage and have a strong democratic input in all decisions that are taken. So what we say is that the social solidarity economy is not a sector, but it's a vector, that is a way of changing our society. And finally, I would finish with this for now, maybe give you a few examples later. It's an alternative to the capitalist system. But it's also an alternative to state-dominated systems. So it's looking at active citizens being not directly elected and taking the place of one of the three parts that you've seen. And today, unfortunately, we have a mixture that is not sort of wanted. We have market states, states that act in favor of only a part of the society, a part of the businesses. But we need a mixed form of economy which puts the citizens and their needs at the center. Taking into account all the aspects that we were saying before. So not just the rights of the people, but also of our planet. That is the possibility of using the resource of the planet in an intelligent and regenerative way. Okay, I will stop here so that we can sort of start a discussion.
All right.
Alekos.
Thanks a lot, Jason. I would just like to add a reflection from where Jason stopped about the natural resources, that our system is usually see the natural resources which are finite as infinite, and the infinite resources, which is the human creativity, as technically making it finite with the copyrights and all this stuff in order to get more profit. So also from the commons-based approach, which is very close to the solidarity economy, and when the people come together, they have more grounded, let's say, solutions, and they really treat both types of resources the way that they are, like the natural resources as finite with more respect, and the infinite resources to be free and collective for all. So maybe we could now open a circle of discussion. I would say that we could privilege first-time speakers, so if somebody had already spoken once, we would give a priority to a person that hadn't spoken. And maybe we could have in mind like to speak for about 2 minutes, so that we have more opportunities, everybody to talk. So
Who wants to break the ice?
Yes, thank you. I'm Alexander Horstmann. I'm teaching anthropology and Asian studies at Tallinn University. And I just, it's very nice to hear that. And I just want to ask you for some examples really of successful, alternative entrepreneurialism. And it would create, I think, a lot of good feeling and hope, I think.
Actually, I have seen it in live. We were with the Estonian delegation in Asti, where is Albergo Ethical Hotel, where are working people with Down syndrome from beginning to the end. And it was very interesting that there was no state money involved, only money from hotel as normal and also investors. And it was very interesting to see. It worked very well because they are doing it in Rome also soon. It was very interesting to see.
Thanks. Before answering you, is there any other?
I have a question. In this solidarity economy, the economic growth is still the main purpose or not?
Okay, I think these two things go a bit together. I may have a slide that explains a bit about growth. Let's see, here. So, if profit is not the main or only aim, what is it? In Latin America, again, because this movement a bit comes from that strong experience of landless movement, the houseless movement, etc. So it's a big struggle that took place for years and years, is still taking place actually. The definition of what we are aiming for is ben vivir. Ben vivir means well living. And it's actually the translation of Sumakawais, which is a Quechua word that has inside much more than what well living can evoke, because it has the relationship with Mother Earth, it has the sense of community, and the fact that we're not just individuals. There's a form of spirituality that is not necessarily religious, but that is being part of, let's say. It's a bit like Ubuntu in the African world. Mm-hmm. And community doesn't really capture this that much, nor does solidarity as a word. But that's what the meaning is of it. So if the end is not profit, but benefit of all, for each and every individual, but also for the community, then our whole approach changes. And we don't see growth in relation to an abstract gross national product number to which we have to always match and say, okay, this year the GNP has been less than last year, so we're in recession, we're doing really bad. We have to see how people are living. What are their problems? What are their needs? If they're met, if they're not met. If the gap between who has more or too much and who has less or very little is widening or it's getting closer, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the real measurements of whether a society is having success and is growing. We have this myth of growth that we have absorbed in some way, and that is very difficult to let go. But success we can measure in many ways, and for an enterprise success is not necessarily becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. It can mean actually being able to replicate in an organic way, so that when it becomes above a certain limit where the relationships inside that enterprise are no longer, I wouldn't say horizontal, but let's say not so vertical and hierarchical, that you lose the direct relationship among people, and you create a role-based system, therefore no longer based on trust and on sort of a mutual understanding, then that size, that cap, is the limit. And it's different from enterprise to enterprise and depending on what it's working on. So there's no fixed numbers that you can say. But what you can say is that when this limit is felt and reached, you can help create a new one. An example is with the CSAs, the Community Supported Agriculture Groups. So these are groups that are spontaneous. Normally a group of friends comes together, number of families, and they create a buying group in support of a local producer. A local farm that usually is organic and that wants to sell directly to its consumers and not through supermarkets or anonymous trade. And these groups grow rapidly. In Italy, we have around 3,000 in the last 10 years, 10, 15 years. In France, they're called AMAP, and I think they're like pretty much the same number, 4,000. In Spain, they're developing a lot. They're different from culture to culture, from country to country, but it's a worldwide movement. They're even in China. And once they reach around 30 to 50 components, that direct relationship inside the group starts to not work anymore. And you have to formalize, institutionalize everything. You have to create a cooperative or an enterprise that will manage all the logistics. So some do that, and it might work, but it becomes something else. Some decide to help create a new one and cooperate with it. And that's how the networks of these CSAs get built. In my city, in Florence, we have 62 groups. It's pretty much the size of this. How many inhabitants do you have here in Tallinn? 400,000? Yeah, Florence is, I think, 365,000 or something like that. So pretty much the same size. So there's 60-something groups. Some are pretty big, like 80 families, and each family might even, they get a basket usually with the produce, but today you can actually buy not just food, many other things. We have insurances, we have renewable energy cooperatives, so you become consumer producer of the energy if you become a member. You can buy clothes. Some come from fair trade. Some are produced locally, et cetera, et cetera. So it's growing also in the way you can source alternatively than from the mass distribution. And it's using these principles. It's using the idea that you don't need to, for services, for instance, you don't need to own everything. Car sharing, carpooling, and forms of shared transportation are growing a lot. Some are being co-opted by the market system. Uber is an example of of a sharing economy that is no longer really sharing economy. It's what we call gig economy, or capitalistic version of sharing economy. Why? Because the ownership of the platform is not distributed. Yes, the service is distributed, but the ownership is not. And the profits go in one direction. So we have to be careful also at how the innovation, the innovative models get reabsorbed into the market system. But there are some things of the market system that work and that we can also readapt in the other direction. So I hope I answered some part of it, at least.
Yeah, like to this question, what do you say, like argument when the state comes and say, well, this should be fair transaction, should be market value, you need to pay some taxes for that. Do you have some arguments you would suggest to defend your position?
I think taxes should be paid. There's still a role for the public, and it's an important role. It's how the public is managed that is different, a different issue. But the fact of having roads, hospitals, the education system, etc., managed by the public, that's very important. There can be mixed forms of management, but we need to have a tax system, and it has to be as equitable as possible. So you have to have corporate taxes, but you also have to tax cooperatives and other forms of enterprises. But there are things like initiatives of commoning, from very small ones to larger attempts. For instance, there's a strong movement now to do urban gardening in spaces that are supposedly common spaces, or private spaces reoccupied for that. And that's a volunteer kind of activity that produces goods, food, for those who work on it, but there's no monetary transaction. So there you cannot tax, in a sense. But all of these things have to be a bit rethought, and that's why we're also discussing whether we want new laws or new rules to define and to promote these forms of alternative economies. In France, in 2014, after 3 years of debate, they have a law on social solidarity economy. Being the French, it's very institutionalized. So now all of the sort of grassroots initiatives have the Chamber of Solidarity Economy, the Council of this, and etc. So we're looking at how it's working. Sometimes you lose a bit of the spontaneous part, which is important to renew and to get the creativity out. And that's why laws sometimes are not the best public policy to apply. But it certainly has made social solidarity economy much more popular. There's state support, for instance, for training and education. There's a month, November usually is the month of social solidarity economy, with a lot of initiatives taking place. There's fairs, festivals. So it's something that is being popularized, and certainly it helps to have state support, mainly at the local level, I would say, rather than the national level. But we're also discussing at the European level, in the European Parliament, because the European Commission is promoting social business, which is sort of the market version of solidarity economy. It's a bit like when they took the circular economy and they transform it in something else for profit. They don't really go well together, so you need to separate some aspects of them. But also with the United Nations. The United Nations has the Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development Goals. Many of these goals are informed of the principles and values and practices that came out from the social solidarity economy movement. Now we have to see if governments take them seriously or it's just propaganda.
Should we take like 2-3 more questions so that maybe because if you take like 10 minutes to each question, we won't.
You're right.
So,
But you stopped me.
Can I have a comment on the tax issue?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I just remembered that in Europe now it's also popular, this time bank system where people contribute time rather than money. So let's say I'm a hairdresser, I cut your hair for 1 hour and maybe so I get like 1 hour of time and somebody else can offer me some service for 1 hour, like for example a lawyer or somebody who mows my lawn. But in Finland there has become this issue of should this be taxed? Because even though the money isn't exchanging hands, there is still like a kind of work being done. So this is also quite interesting, like okay, where does that tax issue go to, you know, will these kind of services and systems also be taxed, and then how exactly do you measure it then, like how much should you pay tax? So it's kind of interesting to observe where they will go with it.
Yeah, actually, I was just wondering how the system deals with human greed, because I think a lot of people like the idea of the system, but they don't want to give up their main money on their iPhones and MacBooks, and how they just deal with you're trying to find a balance in the end, or just trying to move over to the system, or solidarity economy, or.
Well, let's put it this way. As I was saying at the beginning, it's not an ideology. Of course, there's strong principles, values behind it, but it's a plural idea of the economy, so there is coexistence of different forms. So long as they don't go in contrast too much one with another. Now, if to produce a luxury yacht, you are in some way exploiting labor and you're using energy in a way that it's taking out from the system and not giving back, or the whole idea of externalities that are not considered normally in businesses. But there are parts that should be part of the business planning itself and all the other phases. If that is in contrast or not taken in consideration, then perhaps no, we should not have yachts of that, luxury yachts. But if you have a yacht that is co-owned by a lot of people, shared, used, and that is giving benefit to many people, maybe it could be rethought. The idea is not that we all have to have uniform kind of lifestyles and etc., but everybody has to have equal basic rights, dignity in labor, gender equality, real democracy, the possibility of associating freely. These are basic things, if you want, but that market economy many times sidelines, if not tries to bring down.
May I hear that from the market perspective is this, and from the other perspective is that the law that we try to enforce all these humanitarian values, let's say, also is not working so good. So if you have to behave because you get a fine, you know. So in a community-based level, maybe we can control greed better. I think that we don't say that we would be, you know, controlled 100% or something like that.
Okay, in a market economy, decisions regarding investment, production, and distribution are determined by supply and demand. So they are the two determinants which determine whether we want to invest or something like that, whether we want to do that project or. But what are the determinants in this? Since it's we termed it as a solidarity economy. So the determinants which are they decides what to do in it.
One more question, if there is? No. Okay.
I have maybe a similar. Did I understand correctly that it requires some type of redistribution of assets, I guess, for it to work properly? Otherwise, the companies that have so much, and then there are people who have like nothing. The people who benefit the most are who have nothing, but the companies, why would they do it? I mean,
how do you get the profit-oriented companies to think like in a humanitarian way?
Yes. Okay. Well, are you sure what you said? Are you sure that the real forces in the market are offer and demand? Is that what actually is happening when decisions on investments are taken today? Whose offer and whose demand? For what? Is the need of the people, the communities, of the city, of a whole region equally balanced and taken into account versus the opportunity of quick profit making in a situation, in a market, or in opening a new market? Who determines the real demand? You can see that in many different ways. I mean, today we have most commodities in the stock market that are priced not because of their real value, if we can talk of real value, but or because they're really scarce or really abundant, but because of speculations that are taking place amongst big investors. So you can have the price of coffee that one month is at this level and the next month is at another level. And the fact that the production this year has been much more or much less is only one variable of that whole system. So I would be careful in saying that those are the two main forces. What are the forces or the sort of the variables that should be really taken into consideration? It's the needs for well living. So how do we attain well living in a community? Eliminating the causes of poverty, of inequality, etc. Those are the issues that we should solve through economy. It's a bit inverting the circles that we have in our mind and consciously. Today, there is sort of the major force is the global financial system. That determines how our economies should be working. The economies are in function of the global financial players, which can be state and market at different levels. But most big players today, some of the big financial players, private ones, are bigger than states in their financial powers. Then there's the economy, and that determines how our society works. And finally, our societies use the natural resources that we have in our planet. This is totally the opposite of how it should be. We have a finite planet, and it's not scarce, it's abundant actually. But it depends on how we use the resources that we have. And our societies should be modeled around an intelligent use of these resources. And economy is to help us do these exchanges to make our communities vibrant, live, thriving. And finally, finance is the leverage system on which we base our economic activities. So it's at the service of economy and not vice versa. And that's the sort of revolution that we need to do, which is not just going down on the streets, but it's actually doing business differently, doing exchanges and satisfying our needs differently. Time banks are a good example. They seem like a strange thing until you actually do them. And it becomes really interesting when they work. And there are places where they work.
We don't have one in Estonia? I think we don't have one.
You don't have not even one?
I haven't heard.
Okay. Well, maybe try one. It's not that difficult, and you don't need to have a big capital to start it. Absolutely not. You need to have a capital of hours and of people, let's say, of people who want to try to experiment, to try it out. And was there another? Did I answer your question? Sort of. Your question.
How to change
and your question as well. Yeah, which are connected. Well, that's a whole cultural issue. We are raised in our schools with television, through advertisement, etc., to believe in a system, and that system is the way things work. It's only looking at a part of how things can work, and actually it's pretty dysfunctional if you look at how it satisfies our needs. We are dependent on buying almost everything. Is that an intelligent way of living in a community? We can question that, and we can experiment different ways and see if those work better. Again, it's sort of a learning process that also has to take place in places like this, but even much before, actually. I have 2 kids, and unfortunately the Italian school system is still based on a very traditional curricula. And teachers, even though there has been an evolution in teaching, are still anchored in an old way of thinking. I am the teacher, you are the pupils, I teach you. Today we have many forms that come out from the studies, anthropological studies, sociological studies, psychology studies, etc., that cooperative learning is a way to solve problems and to learn, and that is much more efficient. Instead of having each one to work on their own exercise, I can work in teams and solve, and learn what I have to learn. And this, if this were sort of from the beginning taught as an approach, then I think it would solve many of the issues of the balance between the individualistic and sort of self-satisfying part, narcissistic part, with a balancing with the needs of a community in which you live and of which you are a part. So if this community is live and lives well, you live better. In general, I mean, this is a logical kind of principle. But it's not something that you just can learn from one day to the other. I think it's by trying, by practicing, And you don't need to convince. You need to give examples and to show that it can work. And then more and more people, as it is happening, sort of change their attitude, and profit maybe becomes less important if you can see that there are other things that are more important in your life.
All right. We are exactly on time. Is there somebody that really wants to make a question? And all right. I would like to just, for closing up, I would like to ask Jason to make two comments on the governance issue, both on inside the cooperatives that are working and that are based on participatory democracy, but also in the networking of cooperative clusters, like in the RIPESS network, which is the intercontinental network for the promotion of social and solidarity economy. Some reflection on these two levels of governance.
Okay, we have another hour, or? Well, it's difficult to say in a slogan, but there's no easy solution. And again, our forms of governance or of organizing and taking decisions, etc., are a bit determined by how we were raised to think. So we still have a lot of problems in how to do networking in the more horizontal democratic way. That said, there are some examples that are working pretty well, but they tend to isolate themselves. So the issue is how to not have closed communities that are fantastic, that are very horizontal and democratic, but then right outside it's a mess, or they're not able to relate to others. I'll give you just a very small example. The Italian network of solidarity economy exists since, I think, 15 years. And now it's a national network that brings together, a lot of regional networks and districts of solidarity economy. Districts are sort of local territorial pacts between the different actors. So the producers, the consumers, the co-producers or prosumers, the local authorities where they are supportive, universities and other forms of educational institutions, both formal and informal, et cetera, social enterprises. So there is this network, and what it does is tries to help the exchange of these practices so that the movement grows. It took 6 years to convince the Italian network to be part of the European network. And the main reason was not because they were against it, but because nobody could represent a network. So it was a big discussion on how do we have a horizontal form of governance and then have someone representing this, which has a mandate, etc., but it's still one person or two people that take decisions for others. So, well, we sort of convinced them a bit by insisting, but also by saying you don't need to represent. What you're doing is you're bringing the experiences that have evolved in Italy in this case to another level, which is not a higher level. And that's my problem saying it this way. It could be this way or another way. But it's sharing it with other forms, similar forms of experiences, and that mutual exchange can happen not in a closed board of people, as in a company board, but even directly through similar experiences. So what we're doing is sort of a hub to help similar networking experiences to share their practices and to readopt them differently if they're useful, if they're considered useful, etc. There's no centralization that is taking place. Is this true? At the end, yes and no, because some decisions are taken at that level. But we have also sort of a slow process. So a decision can be brought back, take time to be reconfirmed, and then reshared again. So patience, flexibility, and accepting the fact that not everything works and is perfect is sort of key to allow this forms of interaction to happen.
Right. So thank you, Jason, very much. From my personal experience also, I've lived this, being in grassroots movements, that we need to accelerate to get together the experience, the wrong and the solution, so that we can learn from each other, because each one, if it starts like a bubble, he repeats the same problems without. So we need also to have a tank to take this knowledge. So thanks a lot. Thanks Mondo, thanks Jason. Probably I'm from Greece, so it seems bad to me to finish on time, so it took like 8 minutes more. And should we remember that social and solidarity economy is not only an economy for the poor, it can be an economy for the broad society and make lives better. Thanks a lot.